I named this channel The Veto because I think the people have the ultimate veto power.
That's great.
It's our freedom. We have the responsibility
Yeah.
to watch over society, to veto the bad ideas in the ballot box.
That's good.
So the moving company U-Haul releases a report every year about migration in America. They just released their 2025 report. The states with the most people leaving are California, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts. They also report that 7 of the top 10 states with the most growth have Republican governors currently, and also 9 of the top 10 went red in the last presidential election. Mm-hmm. How is red state migration changing American politics?
Well, it's a real thing. I mean, you look at what's happening not only in those states, but you look at the red state. I mean, I think it's really a two-faced question. What you're talking about is you're talking about 9 to 10 governors, and governors that are implementing lower taxes, governors that are implementing quality of life improvements, governors that are for life, governors that, I mean, really, when you look at it, you know, I've got a number of stories about this, but when you look at it, it's just common sense. Like you look at a number of governors that are just really enacting just common sense reforms, like parental choice, you know, more school choice options, education savings accounts. You go on down the list. So when you look at it two ways, that's probably the second way when you back into it. The second is, okay, you're looking at those governors, people are thinking about, you know, where to move and what it looks like and low tax states and that sort of thing. So it's the policies. I think when you also look at it from the first part of it is you actually look at where you're living now. If you were living in a California, a Massachusetts, a New Jersey, you look at those states, and obviously they have great natural beauties. You know, you've got oceans and, you know, all that sort of thing, you know, part of it. But when it comes down to it, and you know this from, you know, when people are working 8 to 5s and they got kids in Little League and that sort of thing, it's great to have an ocean nearby or great to have, you know, those things are fun. But if you're paying really high taxes, if, you know, your schools aren't great, if, you know, I hate to say it, but, you know, if, you know, for some reason the Democratic Party wants to push this agenda, and which it's going to be laughed upon, I think, by people in a decade, the transgender agenda that they're pushing on, you know, these states, you know, what bathrooms are who, it's really weird stuff. So you look at this, and that, when you're talking about migration, it's a real opportunity for Republicans. Because, you know, you look at California, and you look at last cycle, New Jersey, where, you know, Republicans had a little bit of hope about New Jersey, and they outperformed, but there just aren't enough Republicans. And part of that is just what you're saying is you got a lot of New Jersey Republicans that are moving to Florida, or they're moving to Arizona, or, you know, they're making that trip because it's just a better quality of life for them.
Right. It's interesting. I often think that you can tell reception by direction, meaning people gravitate to the ideas that they're receptive to. Mm-hmm. And in the marketplace, an example would be you would look at sales. Are people buying that product? You're able to tell whether people are receptive to product by whether they're buying it or not. In the marketplace of ideas, people migrate, they gravitate to the ideas that align with their mission.
Right.
People vote with their feet. In the last U.S. Census report, they indicated that 7.9 million people changed states in 2021, 8.2 changed states in 2022. Obviously, states like Florida and Texas were the largest beneficiaries of that. It's interesting to note, though, that all that migration took place after the last census, meaning the 2030 census is going to be really impacted by a lot of that migration. What's going to happen with the Electoral College map?
Well, I mean, first off, I'm very impressed with all the data you have, Robert. So, I mean, you're definitely going to outdo me with all the data that you've shown here today. You know, I'm going to go to a real simple story. Is during, you know, right after the pandemic, you know, just how people were, you know, kind of playing. You know, my son was playing in a local neighborhood, and that sort of thing. And it really, there's the old saying in politics: it's the economy, stupid, right? Right. You know, that's the 1992, you know, the big, you know, it's the economy, stupid, you know, James Carville, and, you know, even though they're on the other side, game respects game, and, you know, they understand, you know, what they were doing. So anyways, going back to this story, you know, in my neighborhood, I talked to I see a new family, they're there, and I'm just talking to them, and I was like, hey, you know, I haven't seen, you know, oh, we moved here from New York. I said, oh, okay, you know, that's interesting. You know, tell me about that. You know, what is it? Well, you know, they had family there. And the guy looked at me and he goes, man, I mean, I can't afford a house in New York. I can afford a house here in Oklahoma City, and I can live the life we want to live.
Right.
I mean, it's the economy, stupid. I mean, I mean, at the end of the day, people move with their feet, and they vote too. Right. And so when you're talking about the electoral map, I mean, the only thing that I think that I'm going to call you out for missing something here, Robert. So I think the only thing maybe you miss on the electoral map is maybe Georgia. Georgia maybe is the only state that we're looking at that maybe is a little bit more blue tinted in terms of, that one is maybe done the reverse of kind of the red state migration. And so when you look at electoral map, I think you're looking at states like Arizona. I think you're looking at states like Florida. You're looking, those two specifically, you're probably looking at North Carolina. You're looking at some of these states that maybe were some toss-up states, and they're no longer toss-up states. I mean, they're not toss-up states anymore because of the migration, and that's going to happen, as you look towards 2030. And so again, I think that's a little bit of the president having a little bit of foresight here when he's talking about redistricting. I know there's all kinds of political battles about it, but there is a lot of thought about, okay, are there states where it makes sense because of some of these migration patterns that, that we need to think about what happens. And so I think there is a little bit of, not a little bit, there's thought there too. So
I've seen some projections that have said there could be up to a dozen electoral college votes that swing back to Republicans from losses in states like California, for example, just because of population loss. And it's not that the states are getting any more red,
Sure.
It's that they're losing population.
Right.
And then that affects do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you look at the next electoral map, I mean, it's going to be math that's different. I mean, it's going to be different than that is going to be a big factor to it. But also, as you look at 2028 for both parties, it is it is a watershed year for both parties. Are the Democrats, are they going to go to somebody that's transfixated on cultural issues, that wants, that is not your kind of like your centrist Democrat, not your kind of Bill Clinton. I will say Barack Obama was probably a centrist Democrat as he started, hope and change and, that sort of thing. That's what he wanted. I'm not saying he was, but that's what he wanted.
When you look back then, we thought he was like a far left progressive when compared to the Democrat Party today. He's a moderate.
Right. So you look at that. So that's what we have on that side. And I'm no expert on the Democrat side, but I mean, just, we're people and like you can see that it's a watershed year for them in 2028. Sure. Yeah. 2028 also for Republicans. I mean, it will be the first election, without Donald Trump, heading the ticket since, obviously since 2012. And so what does that look like for Republicans? And so it's going to be a very different electoral map. What's competitive, what isn't competitive, what do the candidates look like? I mean, and it's going to be a race where a little bit more, I'd say geography maybe will dictate things a little bit more maybe than some personalities in the race.
Let's go ahead and get to the elections. I want to kind of get your thoughts, because you work across the country on some of the key races that viewers should really keep an eye on. I want to start with states though.
Okay.
What is kind of the current map look like as far as Democrat, Republican control of state houses, governorships? What does that look like? And then what are some key maybe governorships or races that we should look at over the 2026 cycle? Yeah,
so as you look at it, Republicans control, they have a majority of governorships, a majority of attorney generals, a majority of state legislatures. That's not going to change. 2028 is not going to, I'm already skipping ahead to 2028. 2026 is not going to change what that looks like. You may have some numbers slimmed down, like you may have an Ohio or a Pennsylvania that maybe shifts back, back and forth, ping pongs back and forth. You may have an anomaly out there, maybe a Colorado. I mean, there's some things that, could happen that maybe, they shift a little bit, but you're not going to see a ton of change in kind of state legislatures and their makeup. Where the governors and, those races to watch, you look at a state that's, just to our north, you look at Kansas. And so Kansas has been controlled by a progressive, Democrat governor, Laura Kelly there. I'm looking at that race. Can the Laura Kelly coalition of kind of a centrist Democrat? She's, not a, bombastic personality. She's very middle, very low key, and, really tries to accentuate her bipartisanship in her last State of the State address. She kind of laid out a bipartisan way for a Democrat to win. This is cell phone bans in schools. Like, she's been known to cross party lines and do that. So I'm not going to praise Laura Kelly that much, but I'm saying I think Republicans can win that seat. It's a very winnable. I don't think there's a Laura Kelly in that race. So you look at Republicans, picking up, that governor's race, which is, what states, touches, obviously, us here in Oklahoma. Obviously, there's a big race here. So, you look at that's staying red, obviously, and I want to address that. I think there's always this like fantasy, I think, for like maybe the last like 8 years or something, like, oh, a Democrat can win Oklahoma, or oh, what it looks like. And when you talk about voting with your feet, like, a Democrat cannot win the state of Oklahoma because of just the national party and just the awful policies that they've pushed. Like the mainstream, Democrat party is not even close to a mainstream voter here in the state of Oklahoma. And so, the Republican primary for governor, or probably a runoff, you look at it, is going to decide who the next governor of our state's going to be. You look at some of the other states and governorships, kind of what that looks like. I mean, you look at some places like California, like, it's an open seat. It's kind of crazy. Like, you got Steve Hilton, who's a Fox personality or former Fox personality in the race. Can he catch some fire? Can there be so many people in that race that, like, maybe he can catch some fire and, like, something crazy like an Arnold Schwarzenegger, get elected, or Jesse Ventura, third party, something way long ago. That remains to be seen. California politics is crazy. And so, you look at, races like that. But I will say, you look at state question 836 here, the jungle primary state question. Is that going to get on the ballot or not? California has a jungle primary. So top two are headed. So, what that looks like, that's an interesting precursor to, if, that kind of moves in the state of Oklahoma.
So your prediction overall, Republicans will likely remain in control of the majority of governorships in America.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, correct.
Obviously, at the federal level, very tight margins in the House and the Senate. I know you operate, and have races across the country. What are some of the key races that are really at play? The number of swing districts across America has really shrunk over the last few years.
Sure,
right?
sure.
So what are some of those swing races that viewers should really look out for and that you're keeping an eye on?
Yeah, so in the Senate, you're really looking at 3 seats. What kind of you're looking at Maine. Looking at Susan Collins, who's an incumbent there. By all means, people, moderate, Republican, not necessarily, been a conservative bastion of votes, but somebody that, you'll look at, can the Republicans, hold on to that seat. There's obviously going to be, Janet Mills, who's the governor, is, involved in that Senate seat there. The guy who had weird tattoos is out of the race now, and Janet Mills. So, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff happening on the progressive tattoo gate, whatever that is. Maybe he had a tattoo, or what the tattoo means or doesn't mean, or like, I'm not quite sure. So Maine is what you're looking at. You look at North Carolina. You have a former GOP chair, national chair, who's running that as a Republican. You've got a former governor, running there, and so in North Carolina. So can Republicans, can they, that's Tom Tillis' seat, and so can they hold on to that seat? And what that looks like, real tight. And then I look at Michigan. So Michigan is it's a Trump, where he's been successful in. Mike Rogers is running there again. You've got just a crazy Democrat primary again over there, where very, very progressive candidates, really trying to go for the progressive mantle. Mike Rogers, who's a former congressman, ran last cycle, got close. Very statesman-like. Can he, in a year like this where, the economy is, a little bit of a drag, Republicans, and we may get into it later, the national, polling on Republicans has Republicans down, not as much as in 2018, where they, they're supposedly this blue wave or whatever it was, but down, can Mike Rogers do that? And as you look at, Ohio, Minnesota, Alaska, Nebraska, you look at some of those seats, kind of maybe some stretch seats, Sherrod Brown's running in Ohio. I look at, can he, come back? against John Husted, who's former lieutenant governor, who's got appointed to the seat. You look at Minnesota, a seat that, Somali, you talk about Somali Gate, what's happening with, all of that, going on there. I don't think the president is in any way, shape, or form, or his administration is going to just let, widespread waste, fraud, and abuse just happen. Tim Walz is, a very ineffective governor. And so, how does that shape? So if you look at it, people are like, oh, Republicans, it doesn't, I don't see, especially in the Senate, I don't see where, there's like this big like swing. I look at, Ohio, Minnesota, can Republicans, where those swing, can Republicans keep those seats, and then I look at Maine, if Susan Collins wins on election night, I feel pretty confident about, kind of what's happening. So
Thank you so much for watching this content on The Veto. Be sure to like this episode and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. But what are some of those winning messages on the conservative side that going to the midterms that we should look out for?
Yeah, so you look at it, I look at it two different ways. And so the first one is just kind of talk about the Republican electorate, very quickly, because as a consultant, you're kind of running two different streams here. You're running, one is how can you win a Republican primary a lot of times in seats. And then you're looking at, which is the more fun stuff, which is how can you go beat a Democrat? I'm a Republican political consultant. So how can you go beat a Democrat? So, I look at two different streams. First off is President Trump, and I think it was released yesterday, some sort of poll that, 90% of the Republican electorate, I have a favorable opinion of President Trump and the presidency. I mean, I don't know if I've ever seen a Republican, I've seen 80s, probably high 70s. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. Yeah, and I 100%. Yeah, I believe that. So, you look at somebody that has total, enacted his agenda, did what he said he's going to do. You may not like the style sometimes, or you may, I know some people, don't like, maybe, how quickly it happens, but that's a man, who, his whole life, he's been an entrepreneur, his whole life changed things. And so, that's, his style and substance ain't going to change. He's going to continue to deliver those results for the American people. So just look at a Republican primary. You look at, obviously, Trump aligned and, what that looks like, which is very, very vital. But you also look at, where are you at on kind of those common sense measures? Like, where are you at on school choice? Where are you at on life? Where are you at on economic issues? So, and I know, like in a state like Oklahoma, or a lot of states I work in, Kansas, Nebraska, Arkansas, Texas, Missouri, a lot of these races are decided in primaries. And it really is, there are some really stark differences. There are some stark differences between candidates about, what they believe in, in terms of immigration, what they believe in terms of school choice. I don't think there's any, there's, real divides here. So in terms of messaging is, what I always tell candidates is, what do you believe? What are you passionate about? And then let's go talk about those things. You have to be authentic. When you look at, that's very quick on that. When you look at Democrats, you're looking at a lot of economy issues. You're looking at how can you smartly and how can you succinctly talk about the economy and what Republicans are doing to lower cost and make things better. And it's easy to say, Robert, like it's easy to do the mail piece that's, oh, Democrats are bad, Republicans are good, we vote, we'll vote to cut taxes. Like that's easy. Like what's the next layer? Like we're gonna freeze property taxes for seniors, or we're gonna, stop DEI programs, at secondary schools, which is gonna save $20 million, and we're gonna put that into, an ESA account. What is that secondary message that resonates with people?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I really look, when I hear polls today, I really look at it from the lens of what are people paying attention to,
right,
and what they actually think about a subject. It hit headlines a few days ago. A very famous actor that everyone know went on a podcast, and he said that streaming shows are now telling actors and producers that they should say a plot within the story 3 or 4 times, because people are streaming during you actually look at the phones during the streaming shows. And it makes a lot of sense. I think that what that tells me is I don't think the old adage that perception is reality is true anymore. It's all about attention today. Perception is at the mercy of attention in media today. So when you look at polls, it's really about what are people paying attention to, what ideas are grabbing their attention. Right. So we've got limited time, but kind of where's the polling today for conservatives, and kind of where are we at on those messages? You talked about the winning messages, but where are we at today? What are the polls showing? What would you leave viewers with about the chances for 2026?
Well, first off, I always tell people to check the polls that you look at. I mean, so there is just so many like online apps and AI and all that stuff, and so we can do probably a whole podcast about how polling is not accurate anymore. Like I think there's like this thing called like IQ polling or something like that, where you can like do it for like $500 and do 1,000 people like in your geofence and like poll them on something.
Ask
so like
your family. Or
like it's so like and AI is gonna change polling.
Yeah.
I mean, just like a lot of other things in politics, it's going to change it. But just looking at messaging and just looking at conservatives and what to talk about, I became a conservative, and I am a conservative because I truly believe we have the right message. Mm-hmm. I truly believe, like I always tell candidates, there's three things that you really need to believe in order to be a conservative. The first one is that people are better off without government. Like it's pretty simple. Like government gets in the way. Mm-hmm. People are better off without government. That you have to be authentic with your background and personality. In campaigns, and you talked about polling, but also as you talk about candidates, like if a candidate is a small businessman, let's not make them into something they're not. Like let's let them be authentic. If their whole life, if they were a small businessman and will own hardware stores, like let's make them, the small business hardware store guy who talks about how, it's hard to, run a business because of government regulation. So, you have to be so government is in the way. You have to be authentic. The third thing is you have to be willing to fight for it. Because when you get into government and when you are in I would say the sphere of public discourse, there will be so many people who say, oh, well, that really isn't bad government spending, or this program, they only need a couple $100,000, or this only needs $1 million, or like as people start to talk about these things, like it adds up to a lot. And so when you're talking about conservatives and winning messages, you don't have to pass laws in order to be effective. We need government to be cut. Like we need less government. And so that's one of the big things that I always talk to candidates about and talk to people about is we don't need more government. We need a lot less of it. And people, that message always resonates, and that message will never go away as long as we have government. We'll always be fighting government. And so I think that's something to think about. And just as you think about kind of this next election cycle is being authentic in what you're talking about. And so when you're talking about, and I mentioned that when you're talking about economic issues, cutting taxes and, lowering costs and like that sort of thing, it all sounds good. But like, what's the next layer to it? And you have to push, and you have to like kind of like do that research and go that next step. And because people have heard that before. You talk about people looking at their devices and then looking at other things, like people have so many devices, each person has a TV, an iPad, and a phone, and, who knows, whatever. Some people have two iPads, they got an iPad for this, iPad for that, or, two phones, they got a work phone and a personal phone or whatever it is. They're getting all this information. And so it's just a matter of if they see tax cuts and they see that, like, that's great. But if they see tax cuts, no more for seniors, or, you see what I'm saying? Like if you can get that little bit for them and you can get their attention more than like the 3 seconds they're looking there, you probably won a voter over.
Last question. You meet a lot of candidates. You walk them through the process. What is the one thing that people don't know about running for office that they should? What is the biggest thing?
The biggest thing that they should know is that the noise doesn't matter. And I deal with this every day with candidates. The noise doesn't matter. You're going to have always somebody call you and say, oh, your yard sign should have been blue instead of, red. Or, they'll call you and say, hey, I saw you at the Rotary Club and I really appreciated you talking about, taxes, but you really should have talked about the local college and, what it could do to, help the economy. There will always be that noise, and you should listen to it, and that's great. But in politics, there are two things that we measure and that matter: money and votes. And in American politics, more than 80% of the time, the person that raises the most money gets the most votes. And so that's that's why I tell every candidate, the two things that matter are money and votes. Money shows a sign of support. Money shows people that, have latched onto your campaign and believe in what you're doing. And that will come through in a strategy of getting votes. And so that's what I always tell people, separate out the noise and remember the two things that matter are money and votes.
Thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you so much for watching this content on the veto. Be sure to like this episode and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you'd like to join our newsletter, you can visit yourveto.com to get emails about new episodes and information directly in your inbox. Don't forget that we the people hold the ultimate veto power. We'll see you next time.